Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a warm welcome to everybody who have joined us today in this webinar. First and foremost, we hope that everybody is staying healthy and safe. We are excited to be here and that we are able to pivot this event on the theme, fostering an inclusive e-commerce ecosystems in India. For the past several years, e-commerce in India has grown at a breakneck speed, which got further accelerated during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns. The pandemic has exposed the wide chasm between the connected and the unconnected. Therefore, without digital inclusivity, digital innovations, including e-commerce, will continue to increase inequality rather than advancing equity. On this background, CUTS had undertaken a study to explore the means and ways of fostering an equitable and inclusive e-commerce ecosystems in India. Several stakeholders were consulted to obtain research inputs. The research output in form of white paper will be presented today in this meeting by my colleague, Rajshri Agarwal. Two of my former colleagues, Sakhi Shah and Pragya Singh, need to be noted, had substantially worked on this paper and were part of the stakeholder consultations. We at CUTS are keen to take forward the idea of inclusive e-commerce ecosystems under our overarching mission for propagating inclusive digital economy. And we look forward to the panel's deliberation today. Please allow me to introduce you to the stellar panel on the event. We are delighted to have, to start with, Mr. Anil Bharadwaj, Secretary General, Federation of Indian Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises, FISME. He is also a member of the governing board of the Entrepreneurship Development Institute of India, EDI, Ahmedabad. Mr. Bharadwaj has worked extensively in the field of international trade and SME development and has advised or led several SME development projects. Amongst others, he has served as member Damodaran Committee for Reforming the Regulatory Environment for Doing Business in India, Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Member Drafting Committee for National Voluntary Guidelines on Social, Environmental and Economic Responsibilities of Business, since notified by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, Government of India, and member Project Advisory Committee, National Competition Policy and Economic Growth in India. Welcome, Mr. Bharadwaj. Next, we have Ms. Ambika Tandon, Senior Policy Officer, Center for Internet and Society. Ms. Tandon studies the intersection of gender and technology. She focuses on women's work in the digital economy and the impact of emerging technologies on the social inequalities. She also works on project on the future of work, privacy, and feminist research methodology. Welcome, Ms. Tandon. We also have on the panel Ms. Manjushri RM, Research Fellow with the Center of Legal Policy. She works in the area of competition law. She's graduated from Nalsa University of Law, Hyderabad in 2019 and completed a summer course of competition law and policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science before joining WITHI. Her primary areas of interests are international economic law and competition law. And she's also a trained theatre enthusiast and has featured in several plays directed by the National School of Drama. Welcome, Ms. Manjushri RM. And our fourth panelist today is Ms. Gauri Gokhale, partner Nishit Desai Associate, a practiced lawyer for 24 years. She leads the intellectual property, technology, media, and entertainment, data protection law at Nishit Desai Associate. She has assisted several international businesses in India in entry strategy, corporate and strategic deals, litigation, and arbitration. She has also spearheaded several policy initiatives for the technology, media, and telecommunications, TMT space, pharma industry, and the list goes on, including online content companies, gaming industry, IT industry, as also for privacy and data protection laws. She has been named in the several legal directories, including in the Hall of Fame, TMT and Legal 500, a solicitor and registered patent and trademark attorney. Ms. Gokhale is also a member of the Confederation of Indian Industry, CII, and International Masters of Gaming Law, IMGL. She believes in bringing about social change during education to the young minds of today. Welcome, Ms. Gokhale. Unfortunately, our fifth panelist, Mr. Vinod Kumar, President of India SME Forum, will not be able to join us due to some emergency situation. He communicated this last night. The panel will be moderated by my colleague, Ujjwal Kumar, Policy Analyst and Deputy Head of CUTS Center for Competition Investment and Economic Regulation. He has over 20 years of experience in working on trade, IP, competition, and regulatory issues, particularly in health, agriculture, and digital sectors. He's also a law graduate from the University of Delhi. Before the panel discussion begins, my colleague Rajshri Agarwal, Research Associate at CUTS International, will make a PPT presentation on the white paper on fostering an inclusive e-commerce ecosystems in India. Rajshri graduated this year in law from Symbiosis Law College, Pune. Before I hand over the floor to Ujjwal, let me inform you that this event is being recorded and is also streamed live on YouTube. I also request participants to please put forward your questions in the Q&A box. Thank you and welcome all. Over to you, Ujjwal, to take ahead this event.
Thank you, Devesh, for nice introduction. And without wasting much time, and before I start the panel discussion, I request Rajashri to please present the white paper. Rajashri, floor is yours.
Thank you, Ujjwalji. I will just share the PPT. Hope it's visible to all.
Yeah, it's absolutely visible, Rajshri.
Perfect. Good afternoon to all the esteemed panelists and the participants who have joined us today. I'm Rajshri Agarwal, here to present a brief presentation encapsulating the core areas of our white paper on fostering inclusive e-commerce ecosystem in India. The COVID-19 pandemic, as Devesh rightly pointed out, has given an unprecedented push to e-commerce in India, especially in the Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities, where the share of overall e-commerce sales has grown to 46% from 32%. At the same time, the pandemic has had an adverse impact on the socio-economic conditions as well. Is the PPT visible?
I think this has got unshared somehow.
There must be a technical glitch. If I may just take 2 minutes.
Yeah, function 5, perfect. That's better than previously.
Perfect, okay. So as I was saying, so COVID has, as already mentioned, has impacted the socio-economic conditions in India. It has exposed the already existing economic divide, and a wide gap has been highlighted between the connected and the unconnected, revealing just how far behind many are in the digital uptake. In fact, as per one of the World Bank publications, the internet penetration in India managed to reach only 34% in 2019. Has our e-commerce growth really been inclusive? Most MSMEs have struggled to adapt and scale up their operations online, with women-led and homegrown MSMEs witnessing the biggest blow. During the pandemic, millions of Indians did not have access to basic digital infrastructure, including a reliable broadband internet connection. Without digital inclusivity measures, there is a great risk that digital innovations can have. Given its potential to expand the outreach of small businesses and women entrepreneurs, including and not exhausting, creating jobs and income-generating opportunities, it can bring in much desired inclusivity and resilience in our economy. It is already hoped that e-commerce will create over 1 million direct and indirect jobs by 2022. Can an ecosystem which does not adequately benefit MSMEs be considered sustainable? Moreover, the 2021 Global Payments Report by WorldPay FIS claims that India's e-commerce market will be driven primarily by mobile shopping. With a yawning gap in mobile ownership between men and women in India, can such progress be really considered gender sensitive? In light of these pertinent questions, the white paper carves out a roadmap for a much needed inclusive e-commerce ecosystem by providing opportunities, knowledge, access, and skills to digital platforms. Our methodology for the paper has been undertaking a literature review of relevant national and international literature across diverse themes, including components of an e-commerce ecosystem, its impacts, and the good practices followed across nations. The in-depth analysis of the secondary research, reports, and policy-related documents was undertaken for creating a landscape for e-commerce in India. This was complemented with the review of key policies and regulations at all levels, central, state, and local. These steps enable the assessment of the gaps in the existing landscape, which allows or disallows inclusivity in the ecosystem. Finally, basis the gap assessment, few interviews were undertaken with the key stakeholders such as industry players, policymakers, academicians, and policy research institutions. Consultations with varied stakeholders helped in gathering wholesome and nuanced perspectives on the topic. We identified 4 layers imperative to an inclusive e-commerce ecosystem. The basic layer is the digital infrastructure. It signifies the 3 A's as given. Affordable, reliable, and secured digital infrastructure comprising of internet connectivity is necessary in addition to availability and ability to use phones or computers to benefit from such digital infrastructure. The second layer, or the core layer as it is written, comprises of the key actors themselves, that is the sellers, platforms, and the buyers. However, it would be an error to consider that such players are homogeneous groups. For example, urban educated male consumers may be able to navigate the e-commerce ecosystem quite differently from a rural illiterate women consumers. The parameters of inclusivity might differ for a different group of stakeholders. For example, the vulnerable and traditionally marginalized communities, including women, LGBTQ, illiterate, and economically disadvantaged groups. An inclusive e-commerce ecosystem is one which treats such differently placed groups fairly and equitably. Digital infrastructure and key actors in the ecosystem are necessary but not sufficient to make an e-commerce ecosystem inclusive. This brings forth the expanded layer, which includes the secondary actors like the payments and financial service providers, the logistics service providers, including shipping, delivery, distribution service providers, and also advertising and marketing service providers, amongst others. However, the purposes of all these 3 layers forming the bedrock of the system are easier said than fulfilled. Responsible regulatory and governance frameworks comprising optimal standards, practices, rules, and regulations are necessary to ensure inclusivity in the ecosystem and that it remains so even after the stakeholders have entered the ecosystem. Clearly identifying components of an e-commerce ecosystem is necessary but insufficient to ensure its inclusivity. An e-commerce ecosystem can become inclusive only when the design of technologies and platforms is inclusive and considers skills of diverse businesses and consumer groups. The United Nations Capital Development Fund has identified 4 building blocks for the development of an inclusive digital ecosystem. These groups need to be empowered in terms of capacity and ability to provide feedback on technology and platform design, navigate the ecosystem, get solution of disputes, and redressal of their grievances. With the advent of the gig and share economy, workers of key and secondary actors in this ecosystem are increasingly being considered as important. Such an ecosystem has to consider inclusivity can be considered inclusive only when the workers are not unduly exploited, offered safe working conditions, and adequately compensated for their efforts. Along with internet access and coverage, it is equally important to ensure optimal quality of such digital infrastructure. Such and other tools can help better explore and map the existing e-commerce ecosystem. We identified the gaps in India's current e-commerce ecosystem based on which recommendations were given. As for the basic layer, that is the digital infrastructure, one of the first steps in increasing access to the basic digital infrastructure could be accurate and complete data collection with respect to digital economy. This includes internet penetration and mobile ownership, ensuring the extent of usage of internet services by citizens, Such data collection must ensure the representation of vulnerable and marginalized communities. Following the principles of transparency, potential biases and gaps in the data collected should be addressed with data quality checks. Secondly, what lacks is an access to basic digital infrastructure. This can be enabled by introducing more publicly accessible points of Wi-Fi that could be achieved by unbundling Wi-Fi networks as was done for the payment space with the introduction of the UPI, while taking adequate privacy and data protection measures. Providing access does not cater to the inequalities that surround us. For this to be efficiently taken care of, digital literacy must be imparted. We must move beyond the notion of how many consumers have an access to internet. The ideology should tilt towards a qualitative approach of how many are actually upskilled to utilize it in the most efficient manner. For this, skilling workshops could be held. When we talk about the key actors, unawareness amongst the consumers lead to lack of trust and confidence in the digital platforms. To ensure the quality and genuineness of the products, mechanisms should be put in place which cater to a complete and successful transaction to ensure greater and sustained usage of e-commerce services. Also, ensuring safety to the user's data can also instill confidence. There is a pressing need for an inclusive and representative design of platforms and services. For instance, most e-commerce platforms do not offer the option of choosing a gender beyond male and female while signing in. Further, for an easier usage and accessibility for people with disabilities, features such as voice user interface, graphics, and image must be added. Another exclusionary feature of most e-commerce websites is the requirement of an email address to log in or register. This feature fails to undertake the fact that an average number of consumers rarely have an email ID. Promotion of marketplace models will result in inclusivity of small players in an e-commerce ecosystem. As per the present Indian regulation, no FDI is allowed in an inventory model of e-commerce related to multi-brand retail trading. There is therefore a vast scope of reducing proliferation of inventory models in e-commerce ecosystem in India. For instance, the said FDI rules do not apply to the domestic market and the non-MBRT players. As for the expanded layers, that is the secondary actors, access to financial services needs to be prioritized for the vulnerable communities, and this should be aligned with initiatives to increase financial literacy. Therefore, to enable excluded or underrepresented stakeholders like the women or rural inhabitants and disadvantaged groups, it is essential to not only provide access to banking services, but also to easier lending and credit opportunities. To ensure gender inclusivity in access to and usage of financial services, mobile-based payments specifically can be advocated as they hold a promise that they can meet the needs of women in the segment that currently are financially excluded. Besides access, availability and affordability of financial services, it is also imperative to ensure that the logistics service providers, especially delivery and pickup of products, is not limited only to the majority PIN codes, but also to the minority. Thus, the issue of last mile delivery could be fulfilled by building warehouses and micro fulfillment centers at remote areas, enabling faster pickup and delivery. Leveraging the potential of India Post would be crucial in this regard. In order to safeguard the interests of the stakeholders, legal framework and policies should be designed in such a manner that it provides a level playing field and equal opportunities for all. The policies should be coherent with the objective, clear, and in sync with the broader economic and social objectives. And who better understands the needs of the stakeholders than the stakeholders themselves? Therefore, an effective consultation with the key stakeholders as identified above can be an informed strategy for maximizing benefits and creating a more inclusive ecosystem. Given that currently several regulators and government departments enforce policies related to e-commerce, it will be important to ensure clarity in roles of different regulators, preventing over-regulation and regulatory complexity by mandating policy convergence and coordination among regulators. At the same time, over-regulation tends to discourage the entities to enter as well as sustain in the market. A reduced paperwork can facilitate an ease of doing business. Having said all of the above, an essential step in ensuring sustained inclusivity in the e-commerce ecosystem could be to undertake a periodic review of the level and extent of such inclusiveness. Thank you all. We will now be providing a link to the white paper in the chat box for your reference. Any feedbacks and constructive comments are graciously invited. I would now hand over back to the moderator to take the session forward. Over to you, Ujjwalji.
Thank you, Rajashree, for an excellent presentation and on time. So without wasting much time, let me delve into the panel discussion on the topic. Let me first invite Neil Bhardwaj, sir. Let's hear what MSME sector's view are on this topic. Sir, what is your thoughts on the inclusive e-commerce ecosystem in India? What, according to you, should be do's and don'ts for an inclusive e-commerce ecosystem from MSME perspective? What barriers MSMEs face in onboarding digital platforms, and what are the possible solutions? The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Ujjwal, and thanks, Cuts, for this opportunity to have me, giving me the floor to share my views on e-commerce and share also the views of FISME, Federation of Indian Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises. You have posed 3 set of questions, as a matter of fact, about the inclusiveness, about the do's and don'ts, and the problems and the hurdles that MSMEs face. Let me begin with the inclusiveness part. See, first of all, there are several challenges. Challenges are there in onboarding, in taxation, uneven competition, and exporters also face. So let me begin first with onboarding. As the presentation just before me clearly identified and corroborates our experience also, that there is a digital divide that exists in India, especially when we say about rural versus urban, and within the rural also, rural versus tribal artisans who don't know how to join the bandwagon. And they continue with existing exploitative supply chains. Secondly, there is an issue of capacity of people to package and market their produce in the new medium. After all, people would be buying, would be expecting that, you know, their the article that they had ordered, that comes intact, properly packed, with all the instructions to use, etc., where sometimes many of these suppliers may not be fully aware. Then the question of the taxation. An online seller has to be the GST register irrespective of the turnover. Now it becomes a huge barrier for artisans and women entrepreneurs who would not be interested in compliance that is related to GST, because not only it is onerous on small entrepreneurs, but it has a cost also attached to it. And the cost may not justify with a small turnover 5 lakh, 10 lakh rupees. So in offline sellers, as you know, there is already a threshold below which you don't require the registration. A similar threshold is needed to be extended to people who are selling online. Then there is a very important issue of uneven competition in the on e-commerce platforms. They could be steadily crowded out. I mean, MSMEs or small suppliers could be easily crowded out because the platforms are selling their own produce also at the same time. And because they have access to artificial intelligence and the data and everything, so they know who is selling at what price and where from the demand is coming, and they can position their products and outmaneuver the small guy who wouldn't know and wouldn't have access to this internal information. Then when it comes to inclusiveness, there is an issue that exporters face. First of all, as you would be knowing, that if you look at India's export basket, MSMEs still dominate these segments, whether it is gems and jewelry, whether it is apparel, handicrafts, leather, all these products constitute almost 40+% of India's exports. If you exclude the oil and the steel out, almost 50-60% of India's exports essentially is contributed by the MSME sector directly or indirectly. But MNC platforms typically in the e-commerce are not very keen to allow, or you can say facilitate exports from India. There are several reasons. One, of course, is related to the infrastructure, because our ports, our airports are not really geared up fully to process a very high number, very large number of small consignments. And the infrastructure that is needed both for checking and processing the documentation is not fully established as yet. Then there are also issues that are related, regulatory issue, I would say, that are related to customs, because there would be returns coming in, how to process them, etc. But the net result is that the exporting community or the small exporters find it difficult to fully take advantage of the e-commerce opportunities that exist otherwise. Now, the second part of the question that you asked me is the do's and don'ts for an inclusive e-commerce system. I would say I would divide it into two parts. One is to the platforms and the other is to the government. To the platforms, our message would be that there is a need for massive campaigns of capacity building of MSME suppliers. And there are already steps that are being taken. For example, Amazon began a campaign for onboarding of tribal products. The other day, I was hearing that Walmart CEO was here and she pledged $10 billion of exports from India within a few years. Now, I mean, not only such pledges, but they need to come out and start capacity building at the ground. That's very important. Second is that they have to refrain from capital dumping and predatory pricing and deep discounts, which are very serious concerns. And if those are continued, then they would lead to regulatory backlash. Further, my last suggestion to them would be that, let's comply in the letter and spirit and disclose the origin of goods so that the governments can take a more nuanced policy decision based on what is being imported and how they can build the capacity of the domestic manufacturers under Make in India. To the government, there are several things which could be said. First is, of course, to begin with, they have to come out with an e-commerce policy. We have been discussing and debating for quite a number of years now. And there is a need to do away with this artificial distinction between the inventory-based model versus the market-based models. I feel the distinction between the two has got completely blurred. Both use and thrive on digital technologies, artificial intelligence, big data on the one hand, and use mega front and back end stores, whether it is warehouses or you can say the showrooms, using robots and latest technologies of logistics management. So both are hugely capital intensive. The current policy dispensation is likely to result into unintended consequences of domestic monopolies in inventory-based models, which may not be in the interest of anybody. FISME feels that the touchstone of the policy should positively impact the competition and the domestic manufacturing. In the end, the competition will serve both the interests of the suppliers as well as the consumers. Then there is a question of data localization. FISME feels we need to move beyond the policy of the data localization, and we should move also to ensure that the ownership of the data, the Indian data, should be owned by the Indians, and that would eventually allow the Indian entrepreneurs and the startups, which critically need access to the data, of course, after addressing the privacy and security concerns, to play with and develop innovative goods and services, like, for example, China has done. There are two regulatory hurdles that still remain, and I think we need to address them. And one I just mentioned, for example, the GST parity between the online and the offline sellers, and spend money in building the infrastructure and enabling policy for exports by creating infrastructure at the customs and the ports so that e-commerce in large number could become possibility. So these were my initial thoughts. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, sir, for a wonderful and very pinpointed intervention. And we learned that there are capacity building issues at the MSME level, which not only government or civil society, but also industry or the big platforms should chip in and invest in that capacity building in order to promote inclusive e-commerce. We also learned that you want that we should do away with the distinction of marketplace and inventory model. And the touchstone should be such that it has a positive impact on competition and the domestic MSMEs. And these two is likely to be kind of a positive indicator for inclusive e-commerce. You had said lots of points, and then we'll come back later on the second round. So let me invite Ambika. And apart from MSME, another angle or another stakeholder from inclusive, from the inclusivity perspective is women, gender perspective. And we request Ambika to enlighten us on her how she looks at the inclusive ecosystem from gender perspective. What are the do's and don'ts from gender perspective for an inclusive e-commerce system? What are the positives and negatives for women entrepreneurs in the digital market? Your floor is yours, Ambika, and you have 8 to 10 minutes for first intervention.
Thanks so much, Ujjwal, and thank you to Kutz for inviting me. So I'll just start with the last question you asked about the positives and negatives. And first, I'll just briefly cover why we need to be inclusive in the first place and why we need to think about gender inclusivity. And of course, there are social imperatives around ensuring equal economic outcomes for all groups, but there are also economic imperatives. So a survey by the World Wide Web Foundation finds that the failure to ensure that women have equal access to the internet has actually cost low-income countries around $1 trillion is what they estimate over the last decade. And they also estimate an additional loss of around 500 billion USD by 2025 if governments don't take action to actually address the digital gender gap. And women's labor force participation in India currently is quite low, and there were expectations that the digital economy might actually be able to address the fact that the FLPR currently is quite low and actually make the economy more equitable. So, of course, some of the positives, as have been mentioned already, include expanding to new markets that are not actually contingent on geography. So there's of course finding customers outside India's geographies, but also for rural enterprises finding key markets in urban areas with higher purchasing capacity without actually going through middlemen and increasing their profits and margins. But of course, it's not as simple as that, and the costs involved are actually quite high, which I'll get to in a second. But the second part is also that supporting women's enterprises can have strong spillover effects for increased labor force participation for women in general. And there are therefore a number of policy imperatives to be able to actually support women-led enterprises through policy making by platforms and government. So a lot of the challenges that we've actually found that women-led enterprises are facing are similar to what Shri Anil Bhardwaj also described for SMEs, because women-led enterprises are also 98% of them fall within the SME category, within the small enterprise category. And so their challenges, again, as has been mentioned, but I'll go into this in a bit of depth as well, are around digital access and use. And there are two parts to this. One is around access, which means that Indian women are 15% less likely to own a mobile phone, 33% less likely to use mobile internet than men. And in 2020, last year, 25% of the total adult female population owned a smartphone as compared to 41% adult men. And of course, there are intersectional marginalities here as well. So women in rural areas are much less likely to own a mobile phone, as we've discussed as well. And the second part is digital skills. So here the data is slightly older. We have figures from about 2016-17, where women who were actually able to use the internet to look for financial economic opportunities, to search for a job, was just 29% of the total who were actually using the internet. So it's actually the difference between people who have access and then those who are actually able to use the internet effectively is quite large as well. And apart from the general population of sort of women workers, this digital illiteracy and unfamiliarity with digital platforms specifically also harms women entrepreneurs who were then unable to move to online marketplaces, especially during COVID-19. Given sort of limited knowledge around social media, digital marketing channels, high data costs, such that even if women and enterprises or even self-help groups have access to phones for personal use, they are not able to use the internet for increasing financial opportunities. And then the second part, which again has been covered in quite a bit of detail, is lower access to capital. Women entrepreneurs are less likely to be within institutionalized finance, which is the white paper mentioned this as well. They are less likely to be affiliated to banks, for example. They don't have credit histories and are therefore unable to scale or be sustainable because of this, and are also less resilient to crisis periods, and then they have to sort of resort to money lenders and those in the sort of informal lending space. And most of the findings I'm sharing now, I'll just briefly mention, are from a study that the Center for Internet and Society and the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA Federation, carried out earlier this year, where we did interviews with enterprises in various sectors, handicrafts, tourism, Ayurveda products, and we actually found that enterprises do see potential in online marketplaces, both private and public. So public procurement platforms are actually quite important as well. But the investments that they need to make profits through this route are quite high. So high registration rates is one large problem. Then there's a lot of documentation required. These are small enterprises. They don't actually have documents like PAN, GST numbers. And these processes are quite complex, and there's no training that is actually given from platforms to onboard workers. So onboarding onboard enterprises. So these are quite complex to begin with. And then even after registration, there are a lot of prohibitory factors. So one is visibility costs. All platforms actually require enterprises to invest a lot of money to be at the top of search lists, be in the first few pages, which is actually very important to translate into leads and then translate leads into sales. So that entire process is quite investment heavy for SMEs and for women-led enterprises. It's not possible to make that kind of investment. They said, most enterprises said we need one dedicated marketing professional to be able to convert our leads into sales, and that's not something that they can actually afford. And of course, there are also fundamental challenges around the fact that the costs are actually higher for smaller enterprises, so they cannot compete with the kind of predatory prices, as the previous speaker mentioned as well, that come from larger players, as well as the platforms themselves when they sort of enter into these practices that are not in alignment with principles of competition. And they also tend to sort of charge higher commission rates. And sometimes there were also hidden costs around shipping, etc., that were actually quite something that was it had a negative impact, and enterprises felt that they would not want to make that investment actually, because they didn't see the profits from taking this kind of route of registering on e-commerce platforms. And I'll finally just mention one small point around regional language support. That was a quite a big sort of factor as well. Most of the terms and conditions, all of these kinds of important policies are only available in English. They are not accessible to people in regional languages, and the grievance redressal mechanisms are also quite complex, having to go through chatbots and raise tickets, and then not actually getting any redressal through these channels. So in general, it seems to be that platforms have not put enough thought or investment into how these routes can be made sustainable for small and women-led enterprises, and that's something that we need to push for. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ambika, for such a good enlightening first intervention. We learned there are lots of gender-specific hurdles, particularly regarding access to capital, and then there are documentations and cost investment is quite high, including those in the promotion that requires advertisement, because without that it may not be possible. And even if regional language, some usage navigation is possible, terms and conditions and grievance redressal mechanism largely remains in English. That is also a hurdle. We are contemplating another project on focusing only on the women entrepreneurs, and we'll come back to you on the for the guidance on this. So let me move to another panelist. Let me invite Manjushree. And Manjushree, you have been working on competition policy issues from the perspective of small businesses. So what is the importance of relationship between the small businesses and that of the e-commerce platforms for an inclusive e-commerce ecosystem? And what are the highlights and lowlights, or positive or negatives, of such relationship that need to be promoted or addressed to make the ecosystem inclusive? And how does such a relationship translate into competition concerns? I heard Sri Bharadwaj saying about deep discounts and then preferential treatment and all that. And what do you think is the way forward? And lastly, if you think, is the competition authority enough to deal with such, or should we need a platform to business ex-ante regulation?
Sure.
So floor is yours, 8 to 10 minutes for the first intervention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ujjwal, for the question. And thank you again, Kutz, for inviting me to speak here today. It's lovely to be here. And congratulations on a really thought-provoking paper. As Mr. Ujjwal pointed out, my research in the recent past has also been about platform to business users relationship, which is otherwise known as P2B relationships. And at the heart of all of this is, I think, the problem with asymmetrical bargaining power between platforms and small businesses. And I'll get to what it means in a little while. So it's been fairly evident, and I think Mr. Bharadwaj also pointed out, as to how SMEs have been an integral part of India's growth story. Now, with a lot of commerce moving online because of COVID, and with increased mobile and internet penetration, e-commerce has become a separate market in and of itself that's different from brick and mortar markets. Now, what this means is also that a lot of smaller businesses that exclusively operated in brick and mortar stores are trying to make a footing in the e-commerce market. And the e-commerce market currently is dominated, I wouldn't say dominated, but held together by, a handful of platforms that control the entry and exit points in such markets. Now, let's take the example of, say, marketplaces like Amazon or Flipkart or Zomato or Swiggy. In their respective markets, they are very few players, but hold a huge share and therefore decide who gets to partner with them and who gets to trade on such platforms. Now, what this means is that when there are only a couple of giant e-marketplaces that are, tagged against about thousands and thousands of sellers on one side and just a handful of platforms on the other side, there is bound to be an asymmetry in bargaining power, in that smaller business users that want to transact or that want to partner with e-marketplaces such as Amazon or Flipkart do not really have a say in the kind of terms and conditions that are imposed upon them. And this becomes problematic and features and sort of plays out as multiple competition concerns. And self-preferencing or having private labels is one of them. Or being non-transparent about how search rankings or how search ratings are put up on websites is another function of this. So e-marketplaces or these platforms have become indispensable for smaller business users, but smaller business users and platforms really don't have an equitable way of negotiating with each other as to what the terms of their contracts are going to be like once they decide to partner up. And at the heart of all that we are discussing today in terms of P2B relationship, the fact that there is nothing that guards the bargaining between small business users and platforms is something that needs to be remedied. That is, I think, my first response. Second, in terms of what appears to be the highlights and lowlights, I think they all stem from this issue of an asymmetry in bargaining power. And the highlights, when we look at the positives of why e-marketplaces have become so important, it's fairly evident that they offer hassle-free returns and payments and doorstep deliveries, and they have access to millions and millions of customers that SMEs that may not otherwise have access to. This has broken down geographical barriers and has made deliveries to remote places a lot more plausible than it was. But the flip side of it has again been that this has only been the consumer side story, but the seller side story is plagued with issues such as deep discounting, where allegations that platforms are asking smaller businesses to heavily discount and sell their products, so more and more consumers are attracted to the platform. Second, there is no transparency regarding how search ranks are determined on a platform, and this becomes all the more problematic when the platform offers its own goods and products on an e-commerce platform. So the highlights and lowlights for me also stem from what I understand as an inequity in the bargaining power itself, and the legal instrument that targets this relationship, one that understands how the power asymmetry really affects business decisions that are taken in the P2B equation, I think is something that we need to address going forward. In terms of an ex-ante regulation, there is a little bit of context to this, in that competition law primarily has been very corrective or remedial in what it does. And what I mean by this is that when we look at any other law, it asks us to do a certain thing largely. If you look at telecom laws, or if you look at, say, food safety laws, it talks about standards that that a business needs to stick with. But competition law does the opposite of that. It tells you what not to do. A simple analogy would be, sectoral laws or other laws generally lay down the rules of the game, and competition law is sector agnostic and tries to be the umpire of this game. Now, the problem that we see in e-commerce, and I'm sure Gauri will be able to talk about this with better depth and detail, is that e-commerce regulation in India today is not streamlined. We have multiple ministries, multiple authorities, multiple regulators and laws that regulate e-commerce in a very fragmented fashion. So what this has done is that all of these laws that are supposed to have acted ex ante, in that before a conduct itself occurs, has not been effective in setting down the rules of the game. What this means is that what is left for competition law to do once something happens, the burden on competition law to treat something once it happens is far higher. So given that e-commerce in itself is not a sector at all, it's a business model at the end of the day. It is about buying and selling online, and it is absolutely sector agnostic. We may not be in a position to have one authority, one central agency that looks at all aspects of e-commerce and all aspects of ex-ante regulation. In situations like this, a sector agnostic regulator like the CCI, I believe would be a better suited authority to kick in some amount of ex-ante regulation in terms of at least a number of do's and don'ts as to what is permissible in a P2B equation, what is not permissible in a P2B equation. Even if there are a limited list of do's and don'ts that platform and business user relationships are able to adhere by, will be a significant step forward in trying to really remedy the situation. So an ex-ante regulation, while I do support it, always bears the risk of some amount of chilling effect, but I mean, more about that maybe in the next round. But in terms of an ex-ante regulation, I would say that a very flexible approach that lays down, that takes a principled approach to a list of do's and don'ts, and that stands as an ombudsman between platforms and large platforms and small business users when they negotiate with one another, might be a more equitable way going forward. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Manjushree. I will come back to on this point of ombudsman and kind of alternative mechanism that you have in mind. And we like to take cognizance of that and would like to deliberate on that in second round. You very well articulated that the asymmetric bargaining power is the crux is the Gangotri from where all the kind of concerns are flowing. And I understand that there is a concept of superior bargaining power or abuse of superior bargaining power in Japan and perhaps in Taiwan also. Maybe the time has come to propagate such kind of that is in the competition law parlance, in fact, itself. Let me invite now the last panelist of the day, Gauri. And Gauri, you have heard everybody, and I'm sure you have got lots of regulatory issues in your baskets to reflect upon. So, and needless to say that the importance of e-commerce policy and regulatory landscape has come out from the previous panelist as well. So what according to are the importance and what according to you should be the do's and don'ts in this e-commerce policy and regulatory landscape in order to achieve inclusiveness in e-commerce ecosystem? What will be your policy prescriptions to the government in this regard? Gauri, 8 to 10 minutes and we'll come back.
Sure. Thank you. First, let me congratulate on a brilliant paper that you have put together. I had an opportunity to read it this morning, and Rajyasree presented it extremely well, covering all the points very succinctly. So I echo most of the points that everybody on the panel has said. Being the last person, I don't wish to repeat everything that was said, but I just say I echo the overall perspective. I have been working on this, e-commerce space for a while, and sometimes your views also develop over a period of time, right? So what I've realized is that when you talk about the overall policy or regulations, I want to move away from the word regulation in the first place, right? I want to move away from the concept of a regulator, because what we need in India now is an enabler. It is the enabling ecosystem that we need for fostering the overall commerce development. The reason I use the word commerce is that I do agree with Manjushree that okay, there e-commerce may be viewed as an independent market, but I view it as from a competition law perspective, maybe some developments to be looked into in that regard. But an overall perspective, we need to look at commerce as a cohesive market, because during the pandemic we have realized that the lines between a brick and mortar and e-commerce and all of that are blurring, right? So whenever we are looking at a policy level, overall, we need to look at how the entire commerce will work together, which is domestic, cross-border, and the like. So I feel that the approach overall should be that, I'm just going to use some cliched words, but I feel that they have a value, basically, you should have enabling system for innovation, both on the technology side and business model side. Second, the barrierless entry for the startups is a must in India. And the reason I say this is because all the examples that were given by the panel members, and I'll give us additional example, under the e-commerce rules, or for that matter, even under the OTT regulations, the feedback that we get that all the compliances that are imposed on the sellers are quite burdensome, right? Having a grievance redressal officer, compliance officer, these are just examples, right? So the feedback we get that it becomes an entry barrier, a cost for them to comply. I'm going to come to that in a bit. But coming back, barrierless entry for the startups, investments which are both FDI, domestic, and even crowdsourcing. And the reason I say crowdsourcing is, again, for the examples that were given earlier, where you have rural level sellers, they don't have easy access to capital. Can they have some crowdsourcing platforms where some of us are excited about a particular product which may sort of you want to promote, right? Can we have some access to capital, which is an easier access to capital? The next point would be, of course, development of infrastructure, both soft and hard. When I say soft, even on the skilling side, there has been in your paper also discussion about the skilled workers for the system. Infrastructure, both digital and one additional point I want to build on is the logistics infrastructure, because if you have to penetrate the commerce within the country, including e-commerce, excellent logistical networks are extremely important, which I feel we don't have. Even when we saw it during the vaccine time also, the vaccines that require a particular degree of temperature, unfortunately, we were not, able to sort of use within India, right? So even the cold storage and all of that, right? That particular infrastructure. The next one is, of course, the consumer trust. It's extremely important to develop consumer trust, and I think some of the points were already discussed before. But I'm going to come to that when I talk about consumer, protection overall. The next one, of course, fair competition and employment generation. But I also want to add one additional point is the ESG component of it, right? I think all the businesses today need to focus on ESG. Just as an example, I think, you mentioned, Mr. Bharadwaj mentioned about the packaging aspect. When we talk about packaging, how much plastic is getting used today in the delivery, right? Just yesterday, I got a big package. So much plastic is getting used. Can we have, when the policy is being developed, can we also think about, some of these elements which don't appear on the face of it that important, but they're getting extremely important for an overall, development aspect. So having, discussed these broad elements, now I'm coming to the policy development specifically. The approach, I completely agree, has to be stakeholder consultation based. We have unfortunately seen a fallout, even for that matter, the recent, consumer protection e-commerce rules that came under the Consumer Protection Act. There was such a fallout amongst the ministries themselves, forget the other stakeholders, right? This doesn't, this doesn't reflect a very good picture of a country as a whole. So I think more consultative approach, and the same issue happened even with the recent, RBI regulations on the digital payments. Absolutely zero consultative approach. And I'm sure, we are going to discuss that also this Friday, but that is another example. So it's an extremely important aspect. The other most important aspect is it should be a principle-based approach and not, over regulation, but what is the end goal, and to achieve those end goals, the do's and don'ts can be created. Not the other way around, that you presume that this mischief is occurring in the market and you just try to imagine things without empirical data. So the importance of empirical data also, for example, is being recognized by the courts, even in the recent judgments, that unless you have an empirical data, don't, try to regulate things for sake of it, right? The other thing I want to mention, and I don't think that gets discussed enough, is when we are creating any regulations for the online space, we need to realize the principle of equality under the under the Constitution, Article 14. Sometimes we create over regulation just thinking that digital space is some funny space where we need more regulation. So whatever works offline, the same thing should work online, unless, for example, there are certain things where there is a reasonable nexus, as we always say, to the mischief, to the mischief that you need to sort of take out. For example, under the Consumer Protection Act, I can understand that why you have additional responsibility on the disclosures, transparency, because obviously I don't have access to the physical product to examine, and in that regard transparency and disclosures are required. But anything that is not necessary from a just because it's a digital space, I think the regulations should try to be sort of have an equality in mind. The next one, I think, is on the overall consumer protection. I think this has already been discussed, but the OECD paper of 2016 lays out very good principles on the for the development of the consumer protection in the e-commerce space. Now, here consumer protection I will divide into two separate buckets. You now have you are beginning to see what we call as social commerce, right? And I suggest that your paper also, when you get into the next phase of the discussion, we should discuss social commerce as a concept, because that is developing extremely widely now. We don't realize it, but you will see the next phase as being social commerce. When I say this, under the Consumer Protection Act also, as we know, the sellers or the product seller definition, I'm going to slightly in a nitty-gritty, but it is required, is that when as a consumer I'm buying something, I need to have transparency, disclosure, security, privacy, and all of that, but I need grievance redressal. Now, Consumer Protection Act essentially gives me redressal only against a product seller which is in the regular business. But if it's a one-off seller, I may not be, that person may not be liable under the Consumer Protection Act, right? So these nuances have to be understood. The consumers need to realize that when they are doing social commerce, what are the remedies available, etc. And the last few points I will quickly touch upon, before we get into the next round, is I feel that a PPP model is extremely necessary to develop, especially for the inclusive growth that we have spoken about. So can we have regulations or enabling structures for having a PPP model? You have begun to see, I think you mentioned about marketplace, access, etc. There are certain tech platforms that are enabling sellers to reach the consumers directly, but then there is always, a cost involved in that as well. Or, so can we develop models where you are able to, the slogan that is being talked about is, go local. So how are we able to create these local, supply chains, and the models for that on a PPP basis is something as a blueprint we can consider from a growth perspective. And I echo the last point that that was being discussed is on the overlap. Absolutely important to avoid overlaps. It creates, again, entry barriers for the startups. You have Consumer Protection Act, Legal Metrology Act, food laws, name it, every law. Now they are also talking about Drugs and Cosmetics Act being amended, for the e-pharmacy. How many laws can we keep track of, right? So can we avoid multiple laws for the same topic? I can understand if there are different aspects being covered, but for the same topic, multiple laws, can we avoid that? And I don't want to repeat all the tax points that were mentioned, but the last point is on the FDI policy. We in fact have written an article and are happy to share it with the CUTS team on what are the next steps required in in the FDI policy. You had single brand retail trading being opened up. Can we now avoid e-commerce as an independent thought process? Simply say single brand, whether brick and mortar stores available, not available. Can you simply say single brand open? Because then what happens is you're allowing the brands to come in India, access to better brands from an FDI investment perspective. You will have better investment. You will automatically develop infrastructure, because brick and mortar store is not the only infrastructure that you are developing. You're developing the distribution chain. So large single brands can come to India if you don't insist on on a brick and mortar. Similarly, can we have I agree with what was said earlier. This entire marketplace, inventory based, can we just look at it with a fresh perspective and revise the FDI policy completely? Even the manufacturing companies, they have some elements of retail products. Then it becomes a hybrid model. Unnecessary compliances under FDI policy. I mean, there are nuances to that, but I'm just giving headlines here. So I think a simple FDI policy is a must to attract investment, because if you have foreign investors coming in, they are waiting out there looking at the growth potential in India. The simpler the policy, the larger the investment, and of course the certainty in the policy and not continuous changes, right? So these are my initial takeaways. Sorry if I've overstepped my time, but back to you, Ujjwal.
Thank you, Gauri. No, I think we are almost on time. Very valid points, and too many points in fact. And lastly, on the FDI policy, but I think you made a point when you said that PPP model should be used for enabling environment, and then you emphasized on enabling rather than regulating an ecosystem. So I think that's the way to begin with, but we have lots of political or interest groups which kind of are very visible and then talkative, and are also perhaps very well politically connected, who are able to get across their viewpoints easily than many of the civil society groups who also talk sense. Anil Bhardwaj, may I come back for the second round? You may have heard what Gauri said about many things, if you have anything to reflect upon. And I'll also like you to throw some more light on, you said about data localization. I would like to hear more about that. And secondly, what are your opinion about the event project or mission of ONDC, Open Network Digital Commerce, which is kind of simulating the UPI success, and then perhaps will it be suitable for inclusive, including MSMEs more or not? So you can reflect on any of the points said by any other speakers here, and plus these 2 points what I'm saying.
Thank you. See, FISMA is very clear with regards to data localization. We feel that we need to have a policy for data localization. Data is going to be the most important resource in the digital world. And as it is being unfolded through metaverse and other things, other developments in the next couple of decades, everybody would feel that, through a range of digital tools, almost everything, not only what we do will be captured, but even the invasive devices will ensure that what we think also will get recorded. This may sound scary, and that's why we need to have very strong data localization laws. And not only data localization, as I said, that FISMA is of opinion that ownership of the data should also be rest with India. That's very, very important. There are a couple of things actually that I would like to comment after hearing my colleagues in the panel. And I also feel very strongly about these. See, these platforms, e-commerce platforms, I feel are very, very strong, and they can be put to service for the growth of MSMEs and artisans through right mix of policy interventions. And these interventions could be in the form of incentives and bindings on the e-commerce platforms, not so much from the perspective of regulation. In today's global market, only established e-commerce platforms could satisfy the diverse consumer demand pattern promptly. Because if you look at it, the kind of investment that is required in logistics and infrastructure, it is almost impossible for even a medium-sized organization, even a large-sized company to even fathom. So India should both incentivize and bind the existing new commerce operators to explore supply to export market. And in that area, in terms of concessions, tax, etc., may of course be allowed on the income from exports by the e-commerce operator, like the earlier scheme for traditional exporters. It might be tied for a limited period, maybe 3 years or 5 years. Then incentivizing aggregators through tax and other measures to help small businesses and artisans access to e-commerce platforms, focusing industrial clusters, as you would be knowing that there are already 460 plus industrial clusters and over 3,000 artisan clusters. I mean, if the energies of these clusters could be clubbed with the resources of the e-commerce platforms for accessing global markets, I think this would be a really, really big story. But at the same time, we could also have some binding commitments, like, all new FDI approvals may include a stipulation for e-commerce operators for export. Further, as only MSMEs can provide the supply base for B2C exports from India, both capacity and cost-wise, the e-commerce companies may be encouraged to build capacity of the MSME suppliers in the clusters by allowing spending of their CSR funds for the purpose. So, I mean, there are enough ways to for these companies to invest through the CSR funds as well as through their own proceeds to develop the capacities of MSMEs. Alternatively, these companies may also be asked to create an offset fund from their local procurement from non-domestic manufacturer suppliers in a year, which may be used either for procurement from SMEs or developing their capacity to export through e-commerce. As I said, that development of large MNC-based e-commerce platforms or even homegrown e-commerce platforms is a powerful development, is a very, very, I would say, a development which can really transform. It's very transformative. And I think it would be better if we harness the power of these platforms with the energies of our clusters, and then it would be really a big story for India. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambika, do you want to reflect on any of the points that previous speakers or what is already on the floor? And regarding skilling and access to capital, what according to you are the way forward to go? I mean, how you visualize that?
Right. Yeah. So just on the point of reflecting on what can be the way forward, I think one part of this is, again, like Mr. Bharadwaj was touching on as well, principles and policies to actually encourage platforms to support more women-led enterprises, increase trainings for onboarding, possibly providing incentives to provide subsidies, decrease commission rates or onboarding charges. And I actually think that venture capital funds are a kind of stakeholder that we often forget to think about or target in these discussions. And civil society can actually develop principles, for example, for venture capital funds as well, to encourage them to support platforms that have a higher percentage of women-led enterprises, or actually provide support through venture capital or government funds for self-help groups and enterprises to build their own platforms. That's something that the Self-Employed Women's Association has actually been trying to grapple with as well, to try and sort of develop platforms that would allow them to reach consumers directly. And of course, there are these larger questions around competition and the fact that these smaller platforms will never actually become big enough as Amazon or some of these other bigger players, but they are one kind of alternative sustainable solution. And so, of course, there are some of these other, smaller points around providing trainings and effective grievance redressal mechanisms in regional languages that I spoke about earlier as well. And larger kind of areas that everyone has been discussing, I think there's a gender, um, perspective to be brought into all of them. So when we're discussing telecom, digital infrastructure, increasing access to digital devices, trainings around digital skills, competition law, all of these areas actually have an impact on women-led enterprises. So it's not like, there can be gender policy and something else. There has to be a mainstreaming of thinking of these players, of the thinking of marginalized groups across these various areas of policies and the impact that they will have on women-led enterprises. And of course, people have mentioned this as well, there has to be a consultative approach going forward, actually getting the perspectives of women's enterprises through larger collectives as well as directly. And I think there are examples of platforms taking positive steps as well. So if you look at platforms like Amazon Saheli, they have been taking steps to particularly onboard women-led enterprises. There are also similar examples in China, where Alibaba has been sort of creating the Taobao villages, where they actually try to reach directly to rural artisans and women artisans in particular. And that model has actually worked very well because it's targeted specifically at rural enterprises. But again, the problem still remains that the amount of resources that these smaller they still continue to exist on the fringes, and it's only a consumer who's looking out for Amazon Saheli who will be able to find it. It's not something that's in the mainstream. So there is a kind of need to push, incentivize these further, and push more resources towards these solutions as well. And I lastly just mention the kind of gender composition of the employees and the boards of some of these companies, which are again kind of male dominated with men in top positions of power. Even though women's participation has been increasing in these kinds of professional roles, there is a gap in terms of culture, because women are entering the pipeline but then are sort of dropping off before reaching positions of power at the top, which also speaks to kind of gender biases or inadequate support at the workplace for women employees within technology companies, including e-commerce companies, as well as insufficient support from venture capitalists towards supporting companies and startups that are actually women-led. So yeah, I'll just briefly mention that and stop at that.
2 points. You said that self-help groups and women may build their own platforms. So what I understand is building a platform, creating a platform is not that tough. What is tough is to attain the critical mass of network effect to sustain in the market. So there, I think one has to work and perhaps has to burn some capital to do that. And so, what is your thought on this? How to build the critical amount? And there are people who are able to build platforms, but unlike Nykaa success, perhaps the Nykaa entry into this market can change the game for the women.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
It's a difficult question. I think we've been thinking about sort of pushing venture capitalists as well as governments to try and sort of bring more resources to these alternative solutions. But until we sort of look at these core areas of competition that other panelists have been talking about as well, I think as long as there is this kind of free flow of VC money to burn, there are always going to be deep discounts, and it's always going to be difficult for small players, whether online or offline, to actually compete with larger players. So yeah, I don't actually have an answer to your question.
Coming to Manjushree, your reactions on any of the points you might have picked from before, and B, have you thought about the pro-competition effect that ONDC, if successful, can bring into the e-commerce space? Yes, what are your thoughts and how it can be? And third, would like to know more about the concept of ombudsman that you were proposing regarding to kind of look into the friction between platform and business side. So on these 3 points.
Sure. So the first one, I think, reflection so far, whatever I could take away from the other panelists, I think they're all speaking about inclusivity in a much larger lens in terms of looking at women, looking at other interested groups. But again, my focus has in the past been smaller sellers vis-a-vis a bigger platform. So I'll stick with that because I think I'll be able to contribute better in that respect. As I was saying, when we talk about asymmetry in bargaining power, and when we just look at how that translates into different competition concerns that one may look at, I think another central idea that perhaps one needs to discuss is giving a privacy lawyer a chair in the antitrust table currently, because whenever we understand costs largely in digital markets so far, at least from the lens of competition law, we tend to look at it in terms of monetary costs, but it doesn't stop there. I think attention, loss of privacy, quality are all considerations that I think the competition scholarship is trying to explore, particularly with respect to e-commerce and digital markets. Now, how this affects smaller businesses is that I don't think there is consensus that any data aggregated by these marketplaces or platforms, how do we really value them? And what is a fair way of ensuring that people who are contributing to that generation of data, that is sellers who are contributing to that generation of data, also are equally benefited from that sort of an aggregation? And especially when you look at something like an Amazon or a Swiggy, all aggregated data is a veritable gold mine, especially for products that largely looks at consumer preferences and repeated clicks and repeated time spent on such pages. Any sort of data aggregated is a veritable gold mine. And one central idea around this whole asymmetry in bargaining power is also the lack of conversation on how do we really value this data, and how does value transition from aggregated data from platforms to business users take place. And I think that's one thing that we need to look at. The second thing that you asked me about was about how do we really see an ombudsman coming about in such a situation. And I think I agree with Gauri completely in this, in that I don't think there is a need for extra regulation or introducing another e-commerce authority on top of all the authorities that we have today. And especially given that there is so much overlap between the FDI policy, which is again enforced by the the Enforcement Directorate, and the RBI sort of has some hand in the FEMA, and the DPIIT frames the FDI policy. There is already too many cooks in the broth in the FDI policy itself. Now, similarly, it goes for the intermediary rules that lays down how intermediation power works. But that was, although the definition sort of says anybody that's an intermediary, the kind of obligations are largely towards social media intermediaries, and don't really look at e-commerce intermediaries such as Amazon, etc. And then we have the draft consumer e-commerce rules that were recently published, the draft e-commerce policy, and we've all been waiting its finalization. And as I mentioned, there are multiple instruments that are already regulating e-commerce, but in very very fringe aspects of it are with each and every ministry, so to speak. And this is bound to happen because as we discussed previously, e-commerce is not a sector. So if a pharma sector goes into e-commerce model of delivery, suddenly there will be some additional rules that will kick in upon them. So if food space goes into e-commerce, then suddenly food packaging guidelines, metrological guidelines, etc. kick in, and retail, then there is consumer protection, etc. So I don't think thinking of a regulatory architecture where we have one central authority that is responsible for all e-commerce regulation would be a smart idea, simply given that it is a business model at the end of the day. It is really not a sector. It is a manner in which business is conducted. It's really not one sector that requires expertise in terms of how regulation needs to happen. In the specific context of P2B, that is platform to business users relationship, I think the reason I was suggesting that the CCI becomes an ombudsman is that the kind of allegations that we hear today, or the kind of allegations that I have heard closely from from business users that have partnered with such platforms, largely stem from the fact that platforms are very unilateral in their way of doing things. And this goes back to my issue about asymmetry and bargaining power, in that when there are two business entities that wish to enter into some sort of a contractual agreement, freedom to contract is a central aspect to all of this. But with just 2 or 3 huge platforms that sort of gatekeep the e-commerce space today, small businesses don't really have an option but to partner with them, and that they have become indispensable. The option is either that these small businesses set up their own delivery and supply delivery chain that handles payment, handles marketing, handles delivery, handles everything else, or they partner with someone like Amazon or a Flipkart that already has a wide base of consumers. And as Ambika was also talking about, setting up such an individual delivery system might be an option, but as you rightly pointed out, network effects, as we know, will always kick in, and that will make movement of consumers that have already signed up to something like an Amazon or Flipkart, the migration will be that much more harder. Lock-in will be that much more harder. And the more the number of sellers and the more the number of consumers, such markets will tend to concentrate around 1 or 2 players. So I don't think competition law today, at least in India, the way the jurisprudence has evolved, has a clear answer to such an oligopolistic concentration. Because what we see today is not that there is one big dominant player that we can single out and say Section 4 applies to you, but the existence of 2 or 3 big players that are not big enough to be dominant, but are also together sort of function like an oligopoly with one another, and these set the rules of the game. If Amazon and Flipkart, I had the chance once to look at a few contracts that the clauses of contracts that were debated in one of these webinars, and what I took away from that is that the contracts largely look similar, in that if I'm not happy to partner with one platform, it's not like the other option is extremely rosy. So what it looks like is that all platforms are on one side and all business users are on one side, and because business users are largely fragmented, they are individual in terms of their bargaining capacity with these platforms, they don't really have an option but to accept the kind of unilateral terms and conditions imposed upon them by these platforms. Now, so what can we do? So we clearly agree that e-commerce and e-marketplaces have a lot to offer to consumers. They have a lot to offer to a lot of even business users that have not even dreamt of crossing certain geographical boundaries. But somewhere between all of this is an issue that there is some unfairness in terms of certain practices that are happening in this P2B equation. So what I mean by an ombudsman, sir, is probably either a code of conduct or either something that regulates this relationship. And when I say regulate, I don't mean in terms of new statutory instruments, even subordinate regulation in the terms of the regulations by the CCI or rules by the Ministry of Consumer Affairs for this matter, I think can be done. Something very similar to the IT intermediary guidelines, the ones that came out recently earlier this year, also does something similar. It singles out certain social media intermediaries as significant social media intermediaries and tries to impose additional obligations upon them. And this may also be considered in the e-commerce context, because there is really nothing today, no law that targetedly looks at this asymmetry between business users and platforms. And by the way of an international example, in fact, Australia has something similar called a bargaining code, although that's also in the context of social media intermediaries. The idea remains simple, that the idea remains the same, that there are two entities that are not really at equal footing at one another, and one needs the other more than the other needs the second party. So in such a situation, when there is an indispensability that kicks in like this, I think there is a need for for a regulator to do some sort of an ombudsmanship, maybe not through excessive regulation, because I understand e-commerce is still nascent and we may not want to risk a stifling of innovation at this early on in India, but something that puts them at a level playing field, something that equalizes this bargaining asymmetry between them might be a way forward that is worth exploring.
Thank you. Excellent explanation about the problem. And you rightly said that e-commerce is not a sector. It's a medium. I mean, I would rather prefer a retail policy rather than a commerce policy. And I understand that retail is a state subject. So there again maybe lots of play around between central and state, or if that is tried by the central government. So better be left on that. And regarding some soft guidelines that you said, and I think you are going the same line as CCI has told in the market study of self-regulation. I think perhaps self-regulation in form of, in fact, industry should come together and you know, kind of like in media industry, they have their own. I think it's time that the platforms should come together and have their own ombudsman and have their own guidelines, written guidelines, so that you know, or consumer charter, whatever, or business charter, business side charter. I think some visible efforts would be needed in order to pacify the political debate that is happening, or in the policy making space. And I see from the field of farm laws, you know, either you have it or you don't have it. There seems to be no middle path. I mean, there are many things to be taken and could have been amended, but either you have it or you don't have it. I think I request audience if they have any question to provide in the question and answer chat box. And I'll turn to Gauri again. And if I don't have any questions, then we may wind up earlier as Bhardwaj has to leave. He messaged me that he has some urgent work, so he has left. So, Gauri, what's your thought about convincing the platform industry about having its own ombudsman to address the kind of concerns that the business side is facing? If that is sorted out, knee-jerk reactions like addressing P2B concerns in, say, consumer protection rules,
Right.
not arise. So what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So I think if we really see how the regulations are likely to shape up, is I feel as I think we have seen in the OTT regulations, right? Something as a co-regulatory model. And even if we see the Competition Commission in in Jan 2020, if I remember correctly, had looked into the various practices of the e-commerce platforms in various sectors, which included travel, even I think the food platforms and the like. So they had examined various platforms, and in fact, in the end, had suggested self-regulation, right? So if we look at what Manjushri said and what the CCI had recommended, can we look at something on the principle-based kind of code of ethics that was that we have already seen that as an example in the OTT regulations. I keep going back to that because that is a good example of how the industry worked with the government to come out with the 3-layered process, right? Where they said that, okay, if there is a grievance, then that can be first resolved at the company level. If not resolved at the company level, then a self-regulatory body will look at it. And only if the self-regulatory body is not able to, resolve that, then maybe the, a sort of interference by the regulatory body, right? So what I'm trying to then go back is that self-regulation in my mind should be promoted as a first step of grievance redressal. And because, there are, I would say that the reason I, recommend this is because, not every business model you can straitjacket in a particular, kind of a framework, right? So the more and more business models that will evolve will require a separate, frame of mind or a resolution, in that structure. So, like for example, when you have hybrid model, I think somebody mentioned that where you have your own products plus the sellers, the equations will be different in that, right? When you have simpliciter inventory, there is no question that arises. When you have marketplaces where you have small, small seller, big sellers, and the inequality in terms of the bargaining power, all these are for each model, there may be different aspects that need to be looked into, right? So therefore, I feel that it is a good idea before even, there is an over-regulation as we saw in the proposed e-commerce rules under the CPA, or for that matter, competition commission, requiring to sort of do unnecessary, investigations and spend a lot of effort. Can we first see that, first of all, okay, what is the mischief? Let's identify the mischief that we believe there exists and see whether ombudsman and a self-regulation at a company or a industry level, can it be resolved? If not, then, then look at further step. If we take that graded approach, I feel, that will help us. Then that will avoid over-regulation, and that will encourage, in fact, the stakeholder consultation that we saw in the OTT sector. And, the Ministry of INB, in fact, went out, made presentations, for different stakeholders, explained the regulations on self-regulation, how they should set up and all of that, right? So that conversation and consultative approach will take us a long way, because India is such a big country, so many players. Though today you may feel that there are only, limited players, but there are so many smaller players that are coming up. So, you don't even want startups, getting over-regulated because sometimes what happens is you create a regulation looking at the top 3 players, which in turn, ends up over-regulating the startup ecosystem as well, right? So that is why I feel that is a good way forward. I mean, I'm just giving rationale also why I feel it is a good way forward.
Exactly. So there is a question in the box by Mitali Kshatriya. Is takedown by notice more suitable for e-commerce platform, or takedown only on receiving court and government order?
I can take that question.
Yes,
I can take that question. So I believe you're talking, in the context of under the intermediary guidelines. So the way I look at this is that suppose there are, the platforms, and here I'm assuming you're talking about the marketplace platforms, because there is no question about inventory based taking their own content down. So even if you see now the way the regulations are structured, they are more enabling to the platforms, because the regulation recognize under Rule 3 that you can have your own terms and conditions, and if you believe that your terms and conditions are being violated under Rule 3D, they recognize that the platforms have the ability to take down. The only question that arises that under Rule 4, it is mandated by for the social media intermediaries to give notice, etc., which doesn't appear in Rule 3. So I feel that whilst a takedown is advisable because it is violation of your own policy, if an opportunity can be provided to the sellers before a takedown, that is a more principle based, like natural justice being satisfied, and only then the takedown should be allowed. Because by the time somebody complains to the regulator, goes to the court, etc., it could be damaging to the end consumer. For example, if a seller is selling a counterfeit product, or selling, the products which are not safe, right? And if it comes to the platform's knowledge, based on the consumer complaints, they should have the ability to take down. But as I said, if there is an opportunity given to the seller to explain, that is a more desirable outcome, in my view, rather a process in my view. But to answer your question, yes, the platform should have the ability even without a code or a regulatory order.
Thank you. There is another, could you elaborate on the need for an ex-ante model?
Sure. I can
Yeah.
take this up. So an ex-ante model, let's understand what ex-ante first means. So when we understand regulation, there are two large kinds of regulation that we call ex-ante and ex-post. Ex-ante translates to before something occurs, and ex-post translates to doing something that after that certain thing occurs. In that, if we try and regulate a conduct even before it occurs, it's called ex ante. And if we try and correct that conduct once it has occurred, it's called ex post. Now, when we look at how regulation generally works, it's a combination of these two approaches. In that, there is ex ante approach that is largely followed by a lot of laws, such as I mentioned, telecom laws or food safety laws that lay down certain standards and certain positive obligations that one must meet before, while they're carrying out a business, so as to it does not result in certain things that the law aspires to do. For instance, in the Food Safety Act, there might be a stipulation on the quality of the food, for instance. Now, it tells you that it needs to meet XYZ quality, so they're imposing positive obligations on the entity, and that's an ex ante regulation. Ex post regulation is that once something occurs, what do you do after that? We certain laws try and look at that aspect, in that they are largely prohibitive in nature. They tell you what not to do. Competition law is a good example of ex post intervention, where the competition authority only intervenes after a conduct has occurred. In that, if there is an anti-competitive agreement that comes to the light of the CCI intervenes. If there is an abuse of dominance that has happened, the CCI intervenes then. So these are generally the two kinds of regulation. What I meant by saying that ex ante regulation might be required in the context of competition law is that competition till now, except for maybe merger controls, has largely been ex post, in that it tries and remedies a problem once it has occurred. Now, this may not work for maybe three broad reasons in the digital markets. First, as I said, ex post and ex ante need to work symbiotically with one another, in that they are two hands that go together when you clap, and both of them are what makes a certain kind of regulation effective. And Gauri and the other panelists here have already spoken about how regulation for e-commerce has largely not been very streamlined, and that all of the ministries, departments, etc., that were supposed to regulate e-commerce ex ante have not done a good enough job, which means the kind of baggage that is transferred to ex post becomes a lot heavier than ex post can handle. Ex post competition regulation can handle largely. So for this reason, I think that ex ante competition regulation might be preferred. A couple of other reasons why ex ante might be preferred is one, ex post intervention, largely in the case of digital markets, is largely ad hoc and remedial. There is someone that I happened to meet recently told me that any regulation in competition and digital markets is already 7 years late. In that, by the time we react to something that's happened and carry out our lengthy investigations, etc. The Google shopping case that went on in the EU went on for 7 years. And by the time we finish our investigation and really have a ruling on something like that, the market is probably irreversibly tipped, in that the kind of players that would have stood to benefit from better regulation have already exited the market, and the only survivor is probably the person probably the company that you're trying to find. So the damage has already been done, and remedying something ex post may not be efficient for this reason, in that it does not really seek to optimally restore the market. That may not happen. And for other reasons as well, in that ex ante is largely cost effective. It does not come with the uncertainty of having to investigate cases on a case-by-case basis, allows for more certainty for market players, especially when the business model itself is so new. And all of these are the merits of ex ante regulation. So what we meant by an ex ante model largely in this case is that alongside the existing Competition Act, which prohibits dominance and abuse of dominance, which prohibits anti-competitive agreements and certain anti-competitive combinations, we may have to look at trying to regulate certain entities ex ante, in that give them a set of positive do's and positive sets of do's, perhaps. Like in what something that's being debated worldwide is allowing data portability and interoperability. This is a positive obligation that one may impose on a digital giant to ensure that the ecosystem remains more inclusive. So these are some of the examples of ex ante obligations that may be sharpened or that may be brought about within the confines of the existing legal framework. And these may serve to augment or make the existing regulation around e-commerce much sharper than what it is today.
Thank you. Very well explained. Digital Market Act of EU is a kind of ex ante which will aid the European Commission, the competition wing of that. Again, there is one in UK, I think.
Yeah.
That is helping CMA in that. So we have around 10 minutes. So let's have a round of closing remarks from all panelists, and then I'll sum up, and then we can wind up. So I invite Ambika. You have any closing remarks? You are muted, Ambika. Are you there? Okay, Gauri.
Sure. So, this is something I've been thinking, once I read your paper this morning and after hearing all the panel members, what I feel is for a country like India, I think the center and the states should, with other stakeholders should create something like a task force. There are so many ideas and so many great sort of initiatives that can be taken. But what you need is a kind of a, think tank and a task force which will create a complete blueprint, which can be then implemented through various, policies and enabling regulations throughout the country. Because right now, I have been part of several discussions, research papers and all. I can see brilliant ideas coming to the fore, but I don't see a consolidated effort which one body can take it forward the way we saw for data, a committee that came together or otherwise. I think it's extremely important for creating that strategic blueprint and only then go to the next level, because unless you have a strategy framework, directly jumping into regulation is putting the cart before the horse. So I feel that could be one aspect that we could definitely recommend to the government.
And Manjushree, your closing remarks?
Yeah. So again, thanks everyone. I think I thoroughly enjoyed myself in this panel discussion, and thank you, Karts, again for inviting me and putting this paper together. To be honest, I hadn't really thought very seriously about different sorts of inclusivity when it came to e-commerce. My research till now was largely looking at platform to business relationships, because I identified them as one of the key stakeholders whose voice wasn't perhaps heard enough in the existing within the existing legal framework. But over the past couple of days that I've spent with the paper, and a bunch of things that I've read even outside the scope of competition law, has sort of helped me understand e-commerce from the lens of everybody that's a key stakeholder, perhaps everybody, including the small enterprises or their producers, etc., that start manufacturing beforehand, the kind of product requirements one will have to meet if it's an e-commerce sale versus one if it is a brick and mortar sale. So I think the business model has a lot of bearing on the way the business itself is carried out. And given that we are still at a nascent stage, this might be a good time for us to brainstorm, problematize, and really understand what can be done to build an enabling framework for e-commerce in India. And as I previously said, with more and more commerce moving online, and with more and more just the general way of doing businesses moving to either internet or mobile phones, I think e-commerce it is expected that e-commerce will soon outshine what we understand is mainstream commerce otherwise. So before we head there, before we get to e-commerce becoming the way all things are done and said, I think understanding what are the problems with it, however minute and micro they may be, is a good starting point for us to build an e-commerce, inclusive e-commerce ecosystem. And I'm really glad that CUTS has taken that agenda ahead and put forth a very thought-provoking and well-rounded paper in terms of how inclusivity is not just economic or gender, but it has many facets to it. And I'm quite happy that this is something that's being done.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ambika?
Yes, sorry, I was having some connection problems earlier.
Okay.
Yeah, just I think I'll just echo what everyone's been saying, particularly the point Ms. Gauri Gokhale was making around, having a kind of task force to sort of streamline some of these ideas. As we've understood through this panel as well, we are talking about a wide range of ministries, departments, areas of regulation within that, and perhaps the way to sort of start from a civil society perspective is to put together a set of principles or a way forward, and the white paper, of course, might be the starting point of that, and also as has been done already, kind of with a map of the ecosystem of stakeholders and how all of these all of their perspectives can be brought in. Particularly, I think to the point that Manjushri was making right at the beginning about addressing bargaining power, I think that's something that's extremely important. Both, a large part of my work is towards actually understanding working conditions and the kind of employment that is created within the digital economy. And that's a key concern that comes up there as well. When there is no scope to negotiate, what can a small player like an enterprise or a worker do? And that's really something that we need to sort of focus on as civil society as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Before I sum up, I forgot to ask Gauri her views on ONDC, Open Network Digital Commerce. If she can. You are muted.
I couldn't hear you, Ujjwal. Could you repeat?
I wanted to hear your views on Open Network Digital Commerce initiative that is being taken up.
No, I think some of these incentives, I think are still very new. We need to examine how they sort of, take shape. But as a concept, it appears a viable concept. But honestly, I have still not studied the effectiveness of that. Every idea or a concept is, the success of that depends on the, implementation. So we're yet to examine how that, will pan out.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think the last round, sum up round had sum up the whole debate in form of that there are many ideas, there are concerns, and there are solutions available to those ideas. But the efforts so far has been taking place are disjointed. They need to be streamlined, and perhaps it could be better served if a country has a task force where center, state, because retail is a state policy, a state domain, and other stakeholders, business side, women, consumer organizations, platforms, and other startup groups, all represented. And as Gauri said, that unless we have a clearer strategic blueprint and going forward in a disjointed manner, and reacting on one aspect which is really connected with many whole other aspects in a very kind of knee-jerk reactions could damage this whole emerging ecosystem itself. And as we understand that this e-commerce has the potential to bring in more inclusivity rather than when we think of in physical mode. So by doing away with these concerns and focusing on how this inclusivity can be brought in through digital means is our way forward. And Divesh, would you like to have the floor?
Thank you, Ujjwal. I think the discussion was very proliferating. I really appreciate the converging ideas more in terms of hearing one side from Ambika on how the women empowerment could probably fortify the foray, along with side where Gauri very strategically puts a perfect roadmap in terms of having a blueprint and then moving with a cohesive approach and not with more silos. And Manjushri's opinion in terms of giving it a perfect overture with with all the building blocks together sets the context, and I think this gives a lot of food for thought for the next level approach when we move ahead in this. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. It was exciting to hear all of you, and Gauri has been almost every time we hear her, we have good points, brownie points to go ahead with. So thank you so much. I would again leave it to Ujjwal for the next steps and look forward to catching up again with the next event in such such manner. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, the team behind putting all this webinar, Akshay, Sweetpeace, and Kanchan, and of course, Rajashree and Janisa. Thank you all. See you.